Why do vacations designed for relaxation cause the most spectacular domestic meltdowns? It's all about routine disruption. When the familiar structure of home vanishes, adults overcompensate by obsessing over tiny details. From a brutal roast at a premium wine tasting to a husband forced to do yoga on an atrium floor for a photo, these documented cases reveal what vacation brain really does. 1. Dave and Susan, a couple in their mid-50s from a suburb of Columbus, managed to draw a completely silent, captivated audience of 8 people in the starboard hallway of Deck 8 before the ship had even reached international waters. The inciting incident for this maritime theater was a single, damp pair of floral swimming trunks. Ever notice how the smallest disruption to a carefully laid plan on vacation completely breaks people? Psychologists call this the illusion of control. When individuals lose the familiar structure of their daily routines, they often overcompensate by micromanaging entirely trivial details just to feel grounded. Susan's grounding mechanism was her luggage packing system, which apparently involved 34 individually labeled color-coded plastic bags. Dave had just committed a structural felony by placing his wet swimsuit into a bag clearly marked with a red Sharpie as backup evening wear accessories. Susan was standing in the doorway of cabin 8214, holding the offending Ziploc bag by the corner, as if it contained a highly contagious biohazard, while Dave leaned against the wall, wearing the defeated expression of a man who knew he was about to endure a spectacularly miserable evening over a completely trivial mistake. Susan leaned forward, and using that specific, terrifyingly sharp whisper that carries substantially further than a scream, informed him that the integrity of their entire 7-day Caribbean itinerary had been fundamentally compromised. She explained, loudly enough for the people waiting at the midship elevators to abandon their buttons and walk over to watch, that moisture transfer in a humid marine environment was a scientifically documented crisis. Her emergency silk evening wrap was now at severe risk of smelling like a public wave pool, which meant she would have nothing to wear if the dining room was drafty on Tuesday. Dave attempted to defend himself by pointing out that the bag was currently empty of all other items. This was a catastrophic tactical error. Susan immediately launched into a forensic breakdown of cross-contamination, detailing a complex timeline of hypothetical formal night disasters that would now be entirely his fault. 2 doors down, a man in a bathrobe slowly stepped out of his cabin holding a piña colada, leaning against the doorframe to watch the drama unfold. Dave finally sighed, looked directly at a brass light fixture on the ceiling, and asked if he should just throw his swimming trunks directly into the ocean to restore honor to her luggage. Susan didn't even blink. She simply pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger down the long, carpeted hallway toward the self-service laundry room and loudly instructed him to go sit in there and think about his logistical failures. 2. The casino on a large cruise ship is meticulously engineered to be an overwhelming sensory assault of blinking neon lights, synthesized bells, and chaotically patterned carpets, all designed to bypass rational thought and keep passengers reaching for their cruise cards. Yet, on a Tuesday evening, aboard a 4,000-passenger megaship, every single electronic noise in the room was entirely eclipsed by a woman named Brenda. Brenda possessed a voice that could comfortably strip paint off a steel bulkhead at 50 paces, and she was currently using it to publicly dismantle her husband, Gary. Gary was sitting at a $5 minimum blackjack table, staring intently at the green felt with the hollow, unfocused eyes of a man who had finally accepted his own spectacular defeat. Have you ever seen someone realize they are losing an argument in real time? The argument had escalated 10 minutes earlier when Gary lost what Brenda was loudly and repeatedly referring to as the Grandchildren's College Fund. She had initially demanded that the dealer, a remarkably patient young man from Croatia who looked like he urgently wanted to be assigned to engine room duty, immediately reverse the hand because Gary had fundamentally misunderstood the mathematical probability of hitting on a hard 16. When the dealer politely declined, citing basic casino rules, Brenda escalated the situation from a private financial disagreement to an open-air public tribunal regarding her 30-year marriage. She began pacing behind the row of flashing slot machines, loudly narrating Gary's historical life blunders to any passenger who accidentally made eye contact with her. Within 5 minutes, a crowd of about 20 people had gathered near the cashier's cage. They learned that Gary had bought the wrong kind of riding lawnmower in 2012 that Gary had foolishly trusted his brother-in-law with a timeshare investment in a swamp in Nevada, and that Gary was currently wearing dress socks that didn't match, which Brenda claimed was undeniable. Scientific proof of his inability to comprehend basic blackjack strategy. It's a fascinating quirk of human behavior. People will gladly pay hundreds of dollars for professional onboard stage shows, but absolutely nothing captivates a crowd quite like the raw, unfiltered breakdown of a Midwestern couple over a card game. Gary, realizing that staring in absolute silence was no longer a viable defense mechanism, finally spun his heavy casino stool around and yelled back. He delivered a surprisingly passionate, high-decibel monologue about a grown man's right to risk his own hard-earned money and enjoy his retirement without constant, suffocating supervision. He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, clearly waiting for a round of applause from the other male passengers that absolutely did not materialize. And this is exactly where the situation shifted from a standard domestic dispute into a masterpiece of absurd irony. The casino pit boss, an elegant man in a sharp suit who had quietly wandered over to ensure no physical violence was occurring, gently tapped Brenda on the shoulder. Brenda spun around, eyes blazing with righteous fury, and demanded to know why the cruise line allowed such horrific financial exploitation of the elderly. The pit boss calmly looked down at the digital display on his tablet, then looked back at Brenda, and quietly, but with perfect diction that carried to the entire gathered crowd, explained that Gary hadn't actually spent a single cent of their personal money. He had been playing exclusively with the $200 of non-refundable, promotional onboard casino credit that came entirely free with their booking package. Credit that was rigidly programmed to expire and vanish from their account in exactly 3 hours anyway. The entire casino seemed to collectively freeze. The synthesized bells of a nearby Wheel of Fortune machine suddenly sounded incredibly loud in the heavy, awkward silence. The spectators leaned in closer, fascinated to see how a human being walks back from the absolute edge of a public divorce over completely imaginary money. Gary suddenly looked deeply fascinated by the ceiling tiles, realizing his passionate speech about financial independence was based entirely on promotional arcade tokens. Brenda froze, her mouth slightly open, processing the fact that she had just aired 3 decades of deep marital grievances over maritime monopoly money. The crowd waited for the inevitable embarrassment or the quiet apology. Instead, Brenda took a long, deep breath, looked at the pit boss, looked at her husband, and without changing her furious expression for even a fraction of a second, loudly demanded to know why Gary hadn't told her they had free money, because she would have played the penny slots and actually won. She then forcefully pushed his stool out of the way, sat down in the empty seat next to him, slammed her own cruise card onto the table, and fiercely ordered the Croatian dealer to hit her. 3. The breakfast buffet is where the psychological concept of the sunk cost fallacy ceases to be an abstract economic theory and becomes a terrifying, highly visible physical reality. When people have prepaid for unlimited access to food, the basic biological imperative to stop eating when full is entirely replaced by a desperate, sweaty mission to extract maximum financial vengeance from the cruise corporation. This was the operating philosophy of a young man named Kevin, who became the unwilling star of a morning spectacle at the custom omelet station on day 4. Kevin's partner, Chloe, was currently trying to physically pry a pair of stainless steel serving tongs out of his right hand, while a line of 12 hungry passengers watched in absolute silence. Kevin had already constructed what can only be described as a load-bearing pyramid of bacon on his plate. It was a greasy architectural marvel standing at least 8 inches high, threatening to collapse onto the sneeze guard at any moment. Chloe hissed at him through tightly clenched teeth, her voice echoing perfectly off the tile walls, reminding him that he had already eaten 2 full plates of scrambled eggs and that his daily blood pressure medication was sitting back in cabin 1024. Kevin clutched the tongs to his chest like a medieval knight defending a sacred relic and announced to the entire breakfast crowd that they had paid $1,800 for this vacation, and he was not going to let the corporation win. He argued, with genuine, terrifying passion in his eyes, that every single slice of bacon left on the warming tray was a personal financial loss to their household. An elderly woman waiting patiently for a waffle actually nodded in solemn agreement, validating his deeply flawed economic theory. Chloe simply stared at him for 3 long seconds, abandoned her own plate of melon on a nearby table, turned on her heel, and loudly informed Kevin that he was entirely on his own for their port excursion, because she absolutely was not spending her tropical afternoon dragging a meat-sweating financial analyst who had slipped into a bacon-induced food coma through the Mexican jungle. 4. A couple named Jason and Megan, likely in their late 20s and dressed in meticulously coordinated navy blue evening wear, had successfully stalled traffic on the stairs for 20 minutes. Jason had been contorting his body into various painful yoga poses just to capture the exact low angle requested by Megan, who was gripping the brass railing with the intense, frozen smile of a beauty pageant contestant who knows she's currently in second place. The situation escalated into open theater when Megan marched down the carpeted stairs, furiously swiped through the camera roll on his phone, and loudly declared that he was intentionally making her left arm look like a Thanksgiving ham. Jason, whose forehead was now glistening with the distinct sweat of a man who knows there is absolutely no correct answer to this accusation, tried to calmly explain that it was just the harsh overhead lighting from the chandelier. This defense was rejected immediately. She handed the phone back to him, pointed forcefully to a spot on the carpet, and instructed him to lie flat on his back. Not crouch, not kneel. Flat on his back, directly on the high-traffic walkway located between the busy martini bar and the guest services desk. When he hesitated, citing the highly relevant fact that hundreds of people were currently walking past them holding sticky, colorful drinks, she utilized the ultimate weapon of relationship warfare: public shaming. She didn't yell, but used a brutally calm, projecting voice to announce to the entire atrium that her best friend's husband had hired a professional photographer for their vacation, but she was just bravely trying to make do with what she had. The sheer cruelty of the comparison made a passing bartender visibly wince in sympathy. Defeated and completely stripped of his dignity, Jason slowly lowered his rented tuxedo onto the patterned carpet. He lay there like a chalk outline at a crime scene, holding the phone directly above his face, while Megan retreated back up the stairs, adjusted her posture, and resumed her frozen, flawless smile. 5. The cruise ship art auction is a fascinating psychological trap where complimentary glasses of cheap sparkling wine miraculously convince perfectly sensible adults that they are high-end art collectors. Have you ever witnessed someone make a terrible financial decision just because they were holding a free drink? This temporary delusion struck a man named Arthur from Wisconsin during a Sunday afternoon auction in the ship's secondary lounge. His wife, Martha, had explicitly agreed to attend solely for the free drinks, operating under a strict verbal contract that they would not purchase anything. However, 30 minutes into the presentation, Arthur became deeply moved by a massive, brightly colored painting of 3 neon dolphins jumping through what appeared to be a flaming hoop. When the auctioneer started the bidding, Arthur boldly raised his numbered paddle. Martha, who was mid-sip, nearly choked on her drink. She immediately turned to him and loudly asked if he had lost his absolute mind, pointing out that their living room was decorated entirely in earth tones and they lived 1,000 miles away from the nearest ocean. Arthur, feeling the rush of the bidding war against an elderly man in a Hawaiian shirt, defended his artistic awakening by loudly declaring that the dolphins represented freedom and untamed maritime spirit. Martha did not care about the maritime spirit. She stood up, blocking the view of the people sitting behind them, and announced to the entire silent lounge that Arthur had refused to pay for a new water heater last month but was now willing to drop $2,000 on fluorescent marine mammals. The auctioneer paused, holding his gavel awkwardly in the air, while the audience of about 40 people completely ignored the artwork to watch the domestic financial crisis unfold. Arthur frantically tried to shush her, whispering that he was making a serious financial investment. Martha scoffed so loudly it echoed off the low ceiling. She then began listing everything else $2,000 could buy, including a reliable used sedan or a completely separate vacation away from him. The auctioneer, sensing a lost sale and a potential divorce, gently asked if Arthur wanted to retract his bid. Arthur looked at the painting, looked at his furious wife, and quietly lowered his paddle, sadly accepting that his brief, glorious career as a neon dolphin art collector was over. 6. The Shoreline Excursion Desk is essentially a customer service battlefield where the rigid, unyielding reality of maritime logistics collides head-on with pure vacation entitlement. On the morning the ship docked in Cozumel, a couple named Diane and Mark provided a masterclass in how a minor scheduling error can be instantly weaponized to prosecute 25 years of marital grievances in front of an audience. The queue at the excursion desk was entirely stalled because Diane was delivering a magnificent, uninterrupted monologue about Mark's arrogant refusal to understand the concept of time zones. The core issue was that Mark had insisted on using his smartphone as their only timekeeping device, vehemently rejecting the printed daily newsletter that explicitly warned passengers to keep their watches set to ship time. His phone had automatically updated to the local Mexican time, meaning they had missed their luxury catamaran snorkeling tour by exactly 1 hour. Diane stood at the polished wood counter, holding their useless tickets in the air, and informed the thoroughly captivated line of 30 passengers behind her that Mark possessed a deeply flawed relationship with reality. She loudly detailed how this was part of a broader systemic behavioral issue, specifically referencing a road trip to Mount Rushmore, where Mark had refused to ask a gas station attendant for directions and subsequently drove them into a completely different state. She then pivoted to his inability to follow basic instructions, pointing out that if he could just read the evening newsletter, instead of instantly throwing it into the cabin wastebasket, she would currently be swimming with sea turtles instead of staring at the geometric carpet pattern in the grand atrium. Mark, whose face was slowly turning the color of a ripe tomato, attempted to mount a defense. He passionately argued to the audience that his smartphone synced directly to global satellites, making it entirely unreasonable for a floating hotel to operate on a completely different temporal dimension than the actual landmass they were parked next to. He blamed the captain, he blamed the concept of longitude, and he strongly suggested that the cruise line was running an unauthorized psychological experiment on its guests. Diane cut him off, turning back to Julian, the incredibly poised excursion clerk who had been silently watching the entire exchange with the polite, blank expression of a seasoned diplomat. Diane demanded a full refund, stating that she should not be financially penalized for her husband's technological hubris. She leaned heavily on the counter and loudly declared that this catastrophic failure had completely ruined their 25th wedding anniversary. The gathered crowd murmured in sympathy. A few wives in the line even shot glaring judgmental looks at their own husbands, just as a preventative measure. This is the moment Julian slowly typed their cabin number into his computer, adjusted his name tag, and leaned slightly forward. With a flawlessly polite, melodic voice that carried effortlessly across the silent atrium, he informed Diane that he could not issue a refund for the missed excursion. Diane immediately inhaled, preparing to escalate the argument to a corporate level, but Julian held up a single, elegant finger. He then quietly explained that the reason they could not get a refund for missing the catamaran tour was that their tickets were actually booked for Thursday. Today was Wednesday. They hadn't missed the boat. They were exactly 24 hours early. The silence that fell over the excursion desk was absolute. You could clearly hear the gentle piano music playing 3 decks above them. Mark stopped breathing entirely. Diane's rigid posture instantly dissolved as her brain frantically tried to process the new information. She slowly looked down at the tickets in her hand, then looked at the digital calendar on the desk display, and finally looked at Mark, who was now grinning with a sudden, overwhelming sense of vindication. He stood up slightly taller, smoothed the front of his polo shirt, and asked Diane, in a remarkably smug tone, if she wanted him to ask Julian for directions to tomorrow. Diane simply turned around and walked silently toward the nearest elevator, without saying a single word, leaving Mark standing at the desk to absorb the quiet, scattered applause from the back of the queue. 7. There is an invisible psychological boundary that people cross when they enter the main dining room on a cruise ship. The dim lighting, the heavy silverware, and the presence of waiters in waistcoats often trick passengers into believing they have suddenly been elevated to the European aristocracy. This temporary shift in social class was clearly causing severe friction for a couple from Texas named Richard and Eleanor, who quickly became the focal point of the second seating on Deck 4. Eleanor was deeply committed to the elegant atmosphere, wearing a shimmering sequined gown and carefully studying the French wine list through a pair of designer reading glasses. Richard, however, firmly believed that because he had prepaid for the deluxe unlimited beverage package, all rules of traditional dining etiquette were completely void. The dispute ignited when the sommelier approached their table to take drink orders. Instead of requesting a bold Merlot to pair with his filet mignon, Richard proudly unzipped his nylon daypack and placed a massive, neon yellow insulated Yeti tumbler directly onto the crisp white tablecloth. He then unscrewed the lid, revealing a vibrant pink, highly alcoholic slushie he had transported down from the upper pool deck. Eleanor gasped loudly enough to startle a nearby busboy folding napkins. She leaned across the table, intensely whispering through clenched teeth, demanding he put the fluorescent cylinder away before the surrounding tables thought they were raised in a barn. Richard did not whisper back. He used his full, booming outdoor voice to defend his right to optimal beverage temperature. He argued that a $30 steak deserved to be washed down with a frozen strawberry daiquiri that wouldn't melt in the humid sea air. The debate rapidly evolved into a fierce, surprisingly loud tennis match of conflicting vacation philosophies. Eleanor accused him of lacking basic continental refinement and embarrassing her in front of polite society. Richard loudly countered that continental refinement was just a financial scam invented by cruise lines to sell tiny portions of food on giant ceramic plates. By the time the shrimp cocktails arrived, at least 4 surrounding tables had completely stopped eating to watch them debate whether a reusable plastic straw belonged in a formal dining environment. The argument only concluded when Richard confidently pointed his straw across the table and noted that Eleanor's shimmering evening gown still had the cardboard price tag hanging prominently from the back zipper, entirely deflating her entire argument about high society sophistication. 8. The interactive comedy magic show in the main theater relies heavily on the assumption that a randomly selected audience member will play along with harmless jokes. It absolutely does not account for a husband spontaneously destroying his own marriage in the front row. The magician, a high-energy performer in a velvet jacket, had stepped off the stage and shoved a microphone into the face of a man named Brian, casually asking how many wonderful years he had been married to the lovely woman sitting next to him. This is a standard crowd work question requiring a simple, immediate number. Brian, however, froze completely. He stared at the microphone, then looked at the theatrical lighting rig on the ceiling, visibly doing complex mathematics in his head, before hesitantly guessing, 4 years? The woman next to him, Jessica, slowly turned her head. The theater was completely dark except for the bright spotlight illuminating their specific row, making her icy expression entirely visible to 800 people. It had been 7 years. The show ground to an absolute halt as Jessica completely ignored the comedian, leaned into Brian's space, and loudly asked into the microphone if the last 3 years of her life had been an elaborate hallucination. Brian frantically backpedaled, trying to blame the pressure of the spotlight and the lack of oxygen in the theater. But Jessica was already listing major life events he had somehow mathematically erased from their shared history, including a mortgage signing and a highly stressful kitchen renovation. The magician, realizing he had entirely lost control of his own performance, simply stopped talking, sat down on the edge of the stage, and silently held the microphone closer to the couple so the entire balcony could clearly hear Brian try to explain why he genuinely thought they got married in 2020 instead of 2017. 9. Vacation regression is a psychological phenomenon where successful professionals temporarily lose all emotional maturity the second they are handed brightly colored plastic sporting equipment. This regression was on full display during a windy Tuesday afternoon on the Deck 15 miniature golf course. A couple named Dennis and Pam managed to turn the 9th hole into a deeply uncomfortable spectator sport for at least 20 families waiting behind them. Dennis was a corporate accountant who apparently decided the synthetic green turf was the actual Masters tournament. He spent 5 solid minutes pacing around a miniature plastic windmill, checking the wind direction with his finger, and offering unsolicited anatomical posture corrections to his wife. Pam was holding a neon pink putter and wearing the exact facial expression of a woman evaluating her life choices. The argument erupted when Dennis physically adjusted her shoulders and told her she lacked the core stability required for maritime putting. Pam instantly dropped her club onto the synthetic grass. She informed the gathered crowd of sunburned tourists that Dennis had pulled a back muscle just a week earlier while attempting to tie his own dress shoes, but was now pretending to be a professional athlete. Dennis turned bright red and tried to whisper that she was violating golf etiquette. Pam elevated her voice over the ocean breeze and declared that golf etiquette did not apply to a course featuring a giant fiberglass pirate ship. She then proceeded to loudly list every single domestic repair project Dennis had completely abandoned over the last 5 years, directly linking his inability to finish renovating their downstairs bathroom to his inability to hit a rubber ball through a clown's mouth. The families waiting in line completely stopped playing and leaned against the netting to watch the suburban dynasty crumble. An elderly gentleman holding a melting piña colada was entirely mesmerized by the complex financial details of their failed kitchen remodel. The sheer absurdity peaked when the cruise director announced over the loudspeaker that the afternoon bingo session was starting. Pam simply stepped over the pink putter, kicked her neon golf ball directly into the pool area, and walked away without looking back. Dennis was left standing alone, holding a tiny pencil and a tiny scorecard, trying to maintain his professional dignity, while 2 men wearing identical floral swim trunks slow-clapped his performance. 10. Spatial disorientation is a highly common side effect of cruise travel because the symmetrical hallways and lack of fixed landmarks completely destroy a person's internal compass. It is amazing how quickly adults lose their sense of direction on a floating hotel, isn't it? A couple in their mid-60s named Howard and Helen managed to turn this basic navigational confusion into a highly visible endurance sport inside the central glass elevator. Their disagreement was incredibly simple. Howard firmly believed the main dining room was located on deck 3 forward, while Helen was absolutely certain it was on deck 4 aft. The problem was that neither of them was willing to concede defeat by physically stepping out of the elevator to verify the location. Instead, they stood with their arms crossed and rode the transparent carriage continuously up to the 14th floor and back down to the lobby. They engaged in a relentless debate about who possessed a historically better sense of direction. Because the elevator overlooked the grand atrium, hundreds of passengers enjoying their afternoon cocktails were treated to the slow-moving spectacle of their dispute. Every time the carriage descended past the martini bar, the crowd could clearly see Howard vigorously pointing toward the front of the ship, while Helen stubbornly faced the opposite glass wall. They rode the elevator for 25 solid minutes and entirely ignored the perplexed guests who stepped on and off at various floors. They simply paused their argument politely when strangers entered, stood in tense silence while the doors were closed, and immediately resumed bickering the exact second the strangers exited. 11. Status anxiety often forces tourists into highly elaborate performances of sophistication, just because they are surrounded by strangers in a room with dim lighting. This behavioral quirk completely derailed a premium afternoon wine tasting event hosted in the ship's specialty steakhouse. A couple named Greg and Linda transformed a quiet educational seminar into an impromptu roast of their own marriage. The sommelier had just poured a highly exclusive vintage and asked the 20 participants to identify the subtle flavor profiles. Greg closed his eyes, swirled his glass dramatically, and confidently announced that he detected strong notes of toasted oak and early autumn blackberries. Linda was sitting directly next to him, holding a plate of assorted cheeses. She slowly placed her cracker on the table and loudly informed the entire silent room that Greg exclusively drank discounted light beer from aluminum cans while sitting in a folding chair in their garage. Greg opened his eyes and glared at her, trying to maintain his aristocratic facade by claiming his palate had simply matured at sea. Linda laughed, a highly disruptive sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. She told the wealthy older couples sitting across from them that just last Thanksgiving, Greg had accidentally eaten a decorative wax apple, thinking it was real fruit. The sommelier tried to diplomatically intervene by offering a neutral comment about how wine tasting is highly subjective, but Linda waved him off entirely. She spent the next 10 minutes using Greg's imaginary wine expertise as a launchpad to expose his complete lack of household awareness. She loudly detailed how he recently tried to fix their broken dishwasher using duct tape and an internet tutorial, resulting in a completely flooded kitchen. The other passengers at the tasting table entirely abandoned their expensive wine to watch Linda absolutely dismantle her husband's attempt to look cultured. Greg slowly lowered his glass and stared at the white tablecloth, entirely defeated by the brutal reality of his own domestic history. He spent the remainder of the premium seminar drinking the exquisite vintage exactly like it was a cheap light beer, while Linda happily asked the sommelier for more crackers. 12. The concept of public shame reaches its absolute pinnacle during the maritime tradition known as the pier run. This occurs when a cruise ship blows its final departure horn, and thousands of passengers stand on their balconies to watch late arrivals desperately sprint down the concrete dock. A middle-aged couple named Robert and Patricia managed to elevate this frantic dash into a spectacular rolling theatrical performance during a port call in Nassau. The ship was massive and parked at the very end of an incredibly long pier, meaning the couple had to cover nearly half a mile of open concrete while 3,000 people watched them from above. They were completely exhausted, completely sunburned, and carrying an absurd amount of oversized shopping bags. Instead of conserving their oxygen for the physical sprint, they chose to spend their limited energy screaming at each other about whose fault it was that they were currently starring in a maritime humiliation ritual. Robert was awkwardly jogging in leather loafers while clutching a giant woven sun hat. He loudly blamed Patricia for insisting they stop at a local pharmacy to buy a specific brand of organic aloe vera gel. Patricia was trailing 10 feet behind him, dragging a massive neon green rolling duffel bag with a jammed wheel that sounded like a broken jet engine on the uneven concrete. She used her maximum outdoor voice to inform the entire starboard side of the ship that if Robert possessed the basic spatial awareness to read a simple paper map, they would not have spent 2 hours walking in a circle around the downtown straw market. Their argument echoed beautifully off the hull of the giant ship, allowing the balcony spectators to hear every single detail of their domestic failure. A group of college students on Deck 9 actually started chanting Patricia's name in a show of solidarity, while an elderly man on Deck 7 offered Robert loud tactical advice about his running posture. Robert stopped running entirely, spun around, and yelled that the college students were not helping the situation. This pause allowed Patricia to catch up and deliver a devastating, loud critique of his time management skills, citing a specific incident from 2014 when he made them miss a flight to Denver because he wanted to finish a diner breakfast. The captain blew the deafening ship horn again, signaling that the gangway was about to be completely removed. Robert and Patricia resumed their clumsy marathon, throwing all remaining dignity into the Caribbean wind. They finally reached the base of the ship, entirely drenched in sweat and completely breathless. Two sympathetic crew members in bright white uniforms quickly ushered them up the steep metal gangway and into the cool, air-conditioned security lobby. The couple instantly dropped their shopping bags onto the polished floor and continued their argument without missing a single beat. Robert leaned against a brass pillar, pointing a trembling finger at his wife, and loudly declared that he was going straight to their cabin to pack his bags because this vacation was officially over. He demanded she hand over the blue room key immediately. Patricia crossed her arms, scoffed loudly, and told him she threw the blue room key into the very bottom of the duffel bag and he could dig it out himself. This is the exact moment the security officer scanning their boarding passes held up his hand and completely stopped the argument. He looked at Robert, then looked at Patricia, and delivered the greatest plot twist in the history of pier running. The officer politely informed them that they did not need a blue room key because this particular cruise line exclusively used yellow room keys. Robert stopped breathing. Patricia slowly lowered her crossed arms. The officer gently pointed through the glass lobby doors toward the adjacent pier, where a completely different ship featuring a giant blue logo on its smokestack was currently pulling away from the dock and heading toward the open ocean. Robert and Patricia had just performed a highly public half-mile sprint, aired a decade of deep marital grievances to 3,000 strangers, and successfully boarded the completely wrong ship. The absolute silence in the lobby was deafening. Robert stared through the thick glass doors at their actual vacation sailing away toward the horizon, dropped his giant woven hat onto the polished floor, and calmly asked the security officer what time the buffet opened on this vessel. When adults lose their familiar status, they use public outrage to desperately regain control. So, what's more humiliating? Linda exposing Greg's duct tape dishwasher repair at a wine tasting, or forgetting how long you've been married during a magic show? Drop your vote below. Subscribe for more dry commentary that treats unbelievable cruise ship chaos like actual behavioral case studies.